let's go ahead.
All right, so the last panel we have is the Sacramento Valley water users. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Brock, and members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to schedule these workshops. Oh, is it on? That better? Thank you. Yeah, thank you, members of the board, and Brock, thank you for the opportunity to present here today. I'm going to simply introduce Walter Beret this morning. I think the important thing, of course, is that Mr. Beret will be answering essentially the questions that you have posed for this workshop. But in doing so, I think we're also going to be trying to set the stage for some of the thoughts that we're going to bring into workshops 2 and 3, I think much as you've seen from some other presentations. Mr. Beret has been modeling surface water and other interactions for 25 years. I think is just a well-recognized expert in the state of California and has done work for a whole variety of folks all over the state, but with a real emphasis on areas upstream of the Bay Delta. His presentation will first give you a glimpse into the effect of tides in the Bay Delta. He'll also go through some of the correlation work that you've seen from a variety of presenters over the last day and a half. And then I think most importantly in our view, in his final point, he's going to get to some of the questions I think that several of you have asked from the board on how do we start looking at this as we go forward. And we want to start opening the door for what we think are some better approaches to move forward. And so that at least is the intent today, to open that door and then again continue that ultimately in workshops 2 and 3. And we look forward to the conversations on that as we go forward. So with that, Walter Beret.
Thanks, David. Sacramento Valley water users encompasses quite a large number of folks, and I'm not going to list them all off here, but this is available for anybody to pick up. So the questions that the state board asked regarding uncertainty and what regarding the low salinity zone, and our response is it's highly uncertain whether it is possible to position the low salinity zone to generate specific benefits for Delta fish, but is highly certain that attempting to do so with Sacramento Basin stream flows would adversely and significantly impact many beneficial uses. So as David mentioned, we have 4 basic topics. The first is regarding uncertainty positioning the low salinity zone to generate benefits for delta pelagic fish, and regarding the use of Sacramento River flows attempting to position the low salinity zone. The second point is lack of obvious correlation between Sac Valley water use and the recent decline in pelagic fish. The third point is the hydrologic effects in the Sacramento Valley of possible Bay Delta flow requirements based on unimpaired flow. And this is one of the issues that came up just before lunch, and the studies that we performed that Chuck Hansen commented on. And the fourth topic is managing for multiple beneficial uses. So our conclusions are that daily tidal flows dwarf net delta outflows and cause the position of the low salinity zone to move considerable distances twice a day. The actual position of the low salinity zone and X2 is not known, it's only estimated. And there's considerable uncertainty that attempting to control the low salinity zone or X2 using Sacramento River flows will produce fishery benefits. The second conclusion is Sacramento Valley water use has been essentially stable since the mid-1970s, while pelagic fish have declined. The third point, or conclusion, delta flow requirements based on 50% or 40% of unimpaired flow would have significant adverse impacts on Sacramento Valley resources, including significant reductions in reservoir storage. Fourth, California water systems are managed for multiple beneficial uses, and these uses would suffer under new flow requirements based on unimpaired flow. David already kind of gave an introduction, so I don't really like talking about myself, so I'll move right along. So the first thing I want to touch on are the tides in the delta. When we talk about positioning X2 at a particular location, it's important to know that there's a huge tidal influence, and this particular page from the 1995 Delta Atlas shows that the flows in around Chips Island can vary up to 300,000 CFS twice a day. And in the Sacramento River corridor there in the Delta, it's 70 to 80,000 CFS. And there's other tidal influences throughout the Delta. And this particular animation was developed by John DeGeorge of RMA, and the purpose of the animation is to show the difference between net flows and the tidal flows. And this animation, it starts with 2,000 CFS net delta outflow and linearly ramps up to 100,000 CFS delta outflow. And as I start the animation, you can see how the tidal flows influence the delta much more than net flows in a lot of locations. It's about a 5-minute simulation, so I'm going to start it and just explain some of the key points. And the arrows are scaled to the amount of flow. So here you see the tidal cycles, and the net delta outflow is roughly 2,000 CFS, and you see that the tidal flows can be up to 300,000 CFS. A couple of things to note: at Jersey Point, the net flow is reversed, going toward inland. Another interesting point is in this particular area, the Sac River just below Georgiana Slough, it's tidally influenced at this lower flow. Other things that are interesting to note is that in Middle River and Old River, there's tidal influence. The flow just doesn't go one way there. So we have a lot of tidal influence and very small net flows. So even if you were to increase flows in the Sac River, they're still dwarfed by the tidal influence. So at this point in this animation, we're about 10,000 CFS net delta outflow, and you can still see even at those flows, which would be high flows for summertime, that the delta tidal flows still dwarf the net delta outflows and the net flows in the system. You can note now that the flow at Jersey Point is now headed in a positive direction. And as the flows from the Sacramento River start to increase, you can see that it starts to become more riverine farther down into the delta. Another really important point is the Cache Slough complex in Liberty Island. Water is tidally pumped into Cache Slough twice a day, and that's the predominant flow in that part of the system. And yesterday you saw delta smelt populations, and they're increasing. So that's become an important habitat for smelt as well, as you saw yesterday. So at this point in the simulation, we're roughly 40,000 CFS. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to about 75,000 CFS net delta outflow. And you can see that that's a pretty good wintertime flow event. And even in these higher flows, you still see that delta tidal flows are still more significant than the net flows. And you can see the Sac River becoming more riverine as you come down at the higher flows, and the San Joaquin is doing the same thing. And as you get closer to the end of the simulation toward 100,000 CFS outflow, the directions of Old and Middle River flow toward the end of the simulation will start going the other way. So it does change the net flows in some of the system, and that becomes more predominant in the eastern part of the delta as the flows get higher. It dampens the tidal influence with the higher flows. But still, at the delta outflow, it's still a very predominant flow, the tidal influence.
Just to clarify, so I know what I'm seeing, are you saying that we shouldn't be looking, we shouldn't even be trying to estimate X2? I mean, we should just let it go?
Not necessarily,
Okay.
but there's some uncertainty as to where it is, and the fact of the matter is that the delta is a very dynamic place, and moving X2 a small amount, we're unsure how much benefit we get. And we've seen a lot of snapshots of the low salinity zone at the 3D modeling. It's very good models, but we're seeing one snapshot. We're not seeing how that moves within one single day. Because if you have X2, and the next slide may be a little bit better explanation of that. And this was an experiment done by the USGS last winter, where they put drifters in the delta and saw how far they moved with the tides. And that's called tidal excursion. And what they found is that they put a drifter in at Mallard Island, and it went all the way to Martinez in one ebb tide cycle. That's 6 hours. That's close to 15 miles in 6 hours. And so that's happening twice a day. And so if you're putting the X2 at Mallard Slough or Port Chicago, it's moving very far each day. And when you look at increasing Sac River flow to move the net X2 or the average X2 a kilometer, and it's moving 20 kilometers back and forth, what are we really doing there? There's some uncertainty whether that use of the Sac River flow is really controlling the salinity zone very well and what benefits you get out of that. So that's I'm trying to answer the question of uncertainty and what are we getting from trading off that Sac River flow for moving the net delta outflow, and you still have such a huge tidal influence that you've got the low salinity zone going to Sassoon as well as back up to Mallard Slough all in one day, twice a day. So we are getting the low salinity zone part of the day. It's just a matter of how much of the day that you're talking about by moving the average. This next slide, I'm trying to explain it in yet another way. And there's a lot of information on this slide, so let me take some time to explain the graphs. What I did is I took the continuous monitoring stations at 3 locations: Collinsville, which is at kilometer 81, Mallard Slough, which is at kilometer 74, and Port Chicago, which is at kilometer 64. And this top graph is they're all for the same time period, 2010 from January through May, and they're hourly EC. So what you have on the y-axis is going from 0 to 35. This red line shows you X2 location. And you can see that there's this tidally influence at Collinsville. And we have the same type of plot for Mallard Island, which is here at kilometer 74. And you can see that the oscillations due to the tide. And then the same for Port Chicago, where we have the oscillations. Important things to note on this particular slide is that the oscillations aren't the same. It depends on the moon cycle. You have spring tides and neap tides, so the influence that the tides have are different and different times of the month. The bottom graph is average X2 location. So it's a kilometer from the Golden Gate, and you guys know what this is. And one of the things that I noted, when you look at the March period toward the end of March, and the average X2 is at Mallard Island, you can see that in that same time, the recorders are showing that, hey, it's far west of Port Chicago, and it also moves far east of Mallard Island, and it almost goes up to Collinsville, all within a single day. So the questions that I have are, something to consider is if you're going to shoot for an average X2, you really need to look at how much that low salinity zone and that habitat moves within a single day. It's a really important component.
Could I ask a quick question? Also, there's that horizontal dimension. It's my understanding, based on the presentation we've had, that it is, used as a surrogate. It's an average value. So
that's correct.
Recognizing
that is correct. The X2
daily
is more the average value, and the low salinity zone is what's moving.
Right. And yeah, of course, having worked in measured, monitored, and tidal systems, I respect the variability. Another dimension is the vertical. Could you speak about that, because that's a classic estuarine component, is the vertical stratification. In small tidal systems I've monitored, I see a lot of, it's not just a half and half stratification. It depends on the mass of the water coming in from each direction. So could you speak to the vertical aspects too? That's
a great question. These are bottom ECs, because X2 is supposed to be measured at the bottom of the channel. These locations also have a top EC, and you can look at that incremental difference. So when I put these together, I wanted to focus specifically on X2, which is at the bottom of the channel.
Thank you.
And the drifters were neutrally buoyant particles, so they're not at the bottom, and they may move farther than the bottom of the channel. So if it's 15 miles in one day, maybe the bottom of the channel's 10. Just depends.
Yeah, thanks.
That's still quite a variation, 10 miles back and forth in one day. Another aspect of X2 and uncertainty, I've done a lot of work looking at X2 location and relating it to fish populations. And when I've done that, and a lot of us, I think almost every relationship you've seen with X2 going back in time is using a flow-based calculation of X2, which you take day flow and you apply an equation. On CDEC, they've been posting average X2 location from 2007 through present. And what this plot shows, it shows X2 location beginning in January 07 all the way through 2011. The red dots are the average daily X2 location posted on CDEC. The black line is the flow-based X2 location based on day flow. So when I looked at this, I was wondering how come the EC-based estimation of X2 is so different than the flow-based estimation of X2. And sometimes 5, 10, 15 kilometers different, which is, it's big. That's a very big difference for an average X2 location. And when I started to look into it a little bit more, I noticed that something Dave Fullerton brought up earlier is that the delta bathymetry has changed. We have deeper channels now, so the flow X2 relationship has changed over time. So I came to the conclusion that using that flow-based X2 to relate to fish populations for long periods of time have a lot of uncertainty. They could be off by 10 kilometers, in a lot of years. When you look at 07, 08, 09, where the flow-based equation is showing X2 farther upstream. It's the same with 2010, and this is the example that I had in the previous slide. Here in 2011, it's the opposite for part of the year. So there's a lot of uncertainty even how to measure X2, and when we look at these relationships, what do we really see when we see X2 relationships to fish populations? You've got to be careful on how you interpret that data and how accurate is it. If you go back in time when the delta channels weren't as deep and we had a lot more sediment, we could have showed that X2 was farther out. And there's a paper that Anka prepared discussing the difference between these two calculations. So it's something to consider when you see those relationships. So now I'm going to move into hydrology and use of hydrologic data. And I apologize because you've seen this chart several times yesterday and today. And Paul Hutton had it up a little bit earlier looking at the average unimpaired flow. I'm looking at the average unimpaired flow of the Sacramento River, and there's been a lot of comments made regarding the 56 to 87 period where the average annual unimpaired runoff of the Sacramento River Basin is 23.8 million acre feet. And there's been a lot of comparisons between that period and the 88 through 09 period, which is average 21.8 million acre feet. It's important to note that 2.1 million acre feet is a lot of water for the Sacramento River Basin. That's basically 2 Folsom Lakes full, or roughly 700,000 acres of consumptive use for irrigated area. That's an awful lot of water. So when you're comparing these periods, you got to be careful that you don't introduce hydrologic variability into your conclusion, which has been happening with a lot of relationships that's been presented. This next chart shows a similar thing, but relating the 1990s to 2000. And the difference between the average unimpaired runoff in the Sac Basin is different by 3.6 million acre feet in those two periods. That's 3.5 Folsom Lakes or 1.2 million acres of irrigated consumptive use. You can improve all kinds of things just by averaging different hydrologic periods. It's the largest variable in the system. It has the most fluctuation, and a lot of that flow is uncontrolled below the main reservoirs, as John Lehigh pointed out yesterday. So when I looked at doing unimpaired flow analysis, one thing I noticed looking at the January through June unimpaired delta outflow, and this is an exceedance probability plot with average monthly flows. And what I noticed when I took the average of the 1956 to 87 period and compared that to the 1988 to 2003 period, the average flow in the earlier period was 4,000 CFS more on average during that period alone. So again, the same conclusion, if you're comparing different hydrologic periods, the hydrology is going to drive a lot of your conclusion and influence it. And you could jump to wrong conclusions simply because of that hydrology. Other things that I noticed, if folks want to recreate that time period, you can't recreate wet periods with increased reservoir releases. As Dave Fullerton mentioned earlier, there's different conditions in those wet years. Temperatures are cooler. Overland flow has different chemical composition as a reservoir release. There's sediment, there's nutrients, and when you release water from a reservoir, it's settled out, and that's channel flow, not overland flow. And there's a very big difference between channel flow and wet hydrology, and that's an important thing to realize if you're trying to improve the food web and look at flows to do that, and you look at relationships between wet periods and dry periods, and Dave Fullerton brought this up earlier, is that what's really causing, what's the mechanism that's driving that difference in the historical data when you relate a wet period to a dry period. So it's not just more flow, there's something else there. And if it's overland flow and the chemical composition of that water, you're not going to get that. You're not going to accomplish the same thing from a reservoir release. So that's a really important thing to consider when setting flow requirements. This particular graphic is from the 2010 report, flow criteria report. And this is November outflow, and it's an exceedance probability plot as well. And basically this top line is the actual November flow for the 56 through 87 period. And this lower line is the same type of data, but for 88 through 2009. And there's quite a difference between those two. These particular dots are the unimpaired flow for the whole period of record. So you really can't compare these because hydrology, different hydrologic periods are difficult to compare. But when I compared the unimpaired flow for the same period, the 56 through 87, compared to the 88 through, I think that this is 2003, there's a difference of 10,000 CFS on average in November. So that's the hydrology difference in those numbers. A lot of the rest of the changes is some increased use, but also a change in the way the projects are operating during that period of time. Once again, comparing different hydrologic periods is going to be very misleading. So this is my last chart on different hydrologic periods. We compared, and I think Paul Hutton had a very similar type graph than this. I've got X2 position from 1930 through 2010, and also the Delta Smelt Index. And I've got the water years marked on here. And even though that the delta outflow X2 relationship has changed over time, there are significant variations between the relationship of delta smelt populations and fall delta outflow, or X2. You can see times that the delta outflow is high or X2 is low, and smelt populations are high. Sometimes they're low during that period. So I had a tough time just when I plotted the data seeing a reasonable relationship between outflow and the smelt populations. particularly in the fall. So looking at Sacramento Basin water use, there's been some comments on how water use has increased in the Sacramento River Basin, and that's been based on looking at different hydrologic periods and comparing the flows into the delta for those periods. I've been working on the hydrology and land use-based hydrology for the Department of Water Resources most of my career, and I started out doing this in '87, looking at that land use-based hydrology and calculating water use, and became very familiar with land use data. The land use data has been kept by the Department of Water Resources for quite some time. And during the 1970s, it increased with projects coming online. But since then, 1981 is the peak historical land use in the state, and it still is. We had the drought where we had some lower land use. We had a PIC program, pay in kind, in 1983, so it was lower land use. But for the most part, it's been relatively stable for the Sacramento River Basin. And when I looked at the changes in delta smelt population and tried to look at, okay, well, what's causing that? Is anything we're doing in the Sac Basin causing problems in the delta? We've been doing the same thing essentially for 30 years or more. There's been a lot of work done in the Sacramento River Basin to improve water use efficiency with laser leveling and recapture facilities. They've become much more efficient. And so in some cases, the diversions have gone down, although the consumptive use has been stable. This particular graphic Dave Fullerton had on a poster board this morning. This is from Delta Vision. And when you look at the different use, the bottom is convenient for us because that's Sac Basin use. It's showing that the consumptive use has been relatively stable as well since the mid to late 70s. And looking at this chart, you can stand back and say, what's the largest fluctuation? What variable is fluctuating the most? And that is the hydrology. By far influences everything else. If you look at 83 versus 1977, there's an awful lot of fluctuation there. Another important point, when I looked at trying to impose an unimpaired flow requirement in the model studies we did, I looked at what's the recent unimpaired flow percentage on the Sacramento River Basin. So what this plot shows is the percent of unimpaired, it's historical flow divided by unimpaired, average for each month, and I've averaged it for particular periods. The 56 through 68 period was chosen because that's before Oroville began operation, but after Folsom. And then I did it by decades, 69 to 79, 80 to 89, and 1990 to 2003. And what I found is that the percent of unimpaired flow leaving the Sacramento River Basin has been fairly stable. And the Bay Institute had a bar chart that showed essentially this yesterday afternoon, where they showed the percent of unimpaired flow averaged over this period. I'm showing it monthly, but they did show some variation. I'm going to talk about that variation a little bit more because the water year type has a very large influence on the percent of unimpaired flow. Okay, so this next part is the studies that we did, looking at the effects that unimpaired flow may have on the Sacramento River Basin and the system. And so we had to figure out what percent do we run, because we didn't want to go something too extreme. We ran 75% before, and I think some of you have seen that result. And when we ran a 75% unimpaired flow, we had reservoirs at dead pool half the time, and it was very extreme. So I was asked to come up with something that wasn't so extreme. So what I did is I looked at probably way too much data, but I looked at what is the current unimpaired flow percentage, the average for January through June. And this is similar to what was done in the San Joaquin Basin, is you took what you thought maybe more modest unimpaired flow requirements, and you averaged it for the period. So you have the same percentage for each month during that period. And I looked at historical, and I decided that if I'm going to run a model and impose that on the model, I wanted to know what the unimpaired flow is of the model, so I wouldn't introduce a bias to the modeling. So I took calcium modeling from the latest State Water Project Delivery Reliability Report study. It's the latest public release of the model. And I calculated what the percent of unimpaired delta outflow was. And so what this chart shows is the percent of unimpaired delta outflow. And on the x-axis, this is the average monthly unimpaired flow. So the higher the flow, typically the higher the percent of unimpaired flow is. Inside these circles is an indicator of the water year type. The W's are wet years, and the C's are critical years. So you'll notice that wet years tend to have a higher percentage because use doesn't vary that much. It's pretty stable. So hydrology has the largest influence on what the percent of unimpaired flow actually is. In wet years, for delta outflow, it's around 65% according to the model. In dry years, it's 37 to 40%. So in all years, it averaged to be about 50%. So that's where we got 50% from. Let's run 50%. That's about what the model's saying the average is for that period. And we'll assume we want 50% of unimpaired flow from January through June. And we plug that into the model. And that's where the results that Chuck Hansen showed earlier and the results I'm going to show today are. So this particular chart shows an average flows, and each one of these charts are averaged by water year type: wet, above normal, below normal, dry, critical, and for all years. And these are in thousands of acre feet. So just looking first at delta outflow, average annual delta outflow and our 50% flow requirement would be roughly 1 million acre feet more flow. In some years, the below normal years happen to have the largest impact. 2.2 million acre feet on an average for all below normal years. Some really important components to note are Trinity River. The Trinity River and the balance between Trinity and Shasta set up for existing operation regime. And when Shasta gets very, very low in the models, it tends to pull more water over from Trinity. And the Trinity operation, you know, it's a large reservoir for the amount of flow. So if you pull water out, it tends to persist. The drawdown tends to persist for many years. But on average, we're pulling 90,000 acre feet more from Trinity. Sacramento River Basin outflow increased on an average of 300,000, and Delta exports decreased by 700,000. An important thing to note in the Sacramento River Basin, because I did not cut land use in the Sac Basin, and if you don't do that and you run out of water supply, the model's going to pump groundwater to make up the difference. And what I found is an average of critical years, the model was pumping 1 million acre feet more. And that varied up to 1.6 million acre feet in some dry years and consecutive dry years. It's a physical impossibility. You would really damage the groundwater basin if you'd pump that much. So in those critical years, we were short on water, an average of 1 million acre feet. And in all of those critical years, Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom were at dead pool. So not only would you have to pump that much to meet the demand, but you would need another couple of million acre feet just to get the reservoirs back to an acceptable level. So it's pretty extreme. We didn't try to be extreme with 50%, but when we ran it, we found out that it's a pretty extreme impact upstream. And this is a chart that Chuck Hansen showed. These are exceedance probability plots for Trinity, Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom, where Shasta was at dead pool basically 20% of the time. Trinity got pulled down basically 20% of the time, and the rules for operating Oroville in the model are slightly different, but it hit below acceptable levels 30 to 40% of the time, and Folsom was at dead pool 20% of the time. Something that's really important to me, when we run these studies, we try to meet all the needs in the basin. All the in-stream flow needs, delta needs, water supply needs. And even without the unimpaired flow, we already have a system that we cannot meet the public health and safety needs on a lot of parts of the system, particularly Folsom. The red line for Folsom, you can see that it hits dead pool in a couple years already. So taking more water from Folsom when you can't meet public health and safety in those critical droughts is a very significant thing to me. I mean, what do we do about that? You can't get the water back once it's released. So that's a very important trade-off when considering releasing water for Delta requirements. We had to throw this in. These reservoirs are not at dead pool, but these are historical lows. And like I was saying, we're already having problems meeting fishery requirements, cold water pool requirements upstream, M&I water deliveries upstream. And these are very real situations that have happened in the past. And when we decrease our water supply reliability by increasing delta flows, particularly in the spring and summer, we're going to end up with these situations more often. And it's the balance that you guys have been talking about. How do you strike the appropriate balance between these water supply needs and protecting the cold water pools upstream and the fishery habitat upstream, hydropower upstream, with those flows in the delta? So this is still from the same 50% unimpaired flow study. And I put this up because it really demonstrates the changes in the flow patterns below the reservoirs. So below Shasta, these are averaged by month by water year type. And these flows go from 0 to 10,000 CFS. And you can see that we're increasing springtime flows and the summertime flows decrease. And in particular, every reservoir you're seeing that, below every reservoir. And then delta outflow, you have the springtime increase, but you don't see much of a summertime decrease because we're just cutting exports. And we run out of water and violate other standards. So during the spring period, we already have a surplus of hydropower in the system. And so that increased generation would be lost. And during the summertime, we're backing off on reservoir releases during the peak power production period. So we're going to have some adverse impacts to the hydropower grid. And that'll be talked about, I think, in Workshop 3. And other things to note is that this increase in flow below the reservoirs is before the ag season. So you can't simply cut demands directly to meet the flow, unimpaired flow requirement. It has to come out of reservoirs first. And you're going to end up with a lower reservoir. It's the only way to meet it. You can't just cut ag directly and have that water flow in the delta because it's before the ag season. And the only way to make that up is to back off in the summertime. And if you backed off in the summertime, these flows are needed to meet temperature and fish requirements below the reservoirs, and ag diversions tend to be farther down than that. So we're going to have fishery impacts and temperature impacts in the summertime if we back off on those releases. So, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit more on the multiple beneficial uses and how the same water can meet multiple uses. Just the next graphic. So NACO put out a report that described the flow requirements in the Sacramento River Basin. And a lot of these requirements are set by the State Water Board. Some of them are in the biological opinions. And there's actually a lot more than what you see here because these projects are managed for multiple beneficial uses and to protect the fisheries. So when you look at, say, the operation of Shasta, you have carryover storage requirements, you have temperature requirements in the upper river, you have agreements with Fish and Game, you've got CVPIA and the biological opinions. And on the American River, you've got D893, you've got CVPIA, you've got the NMFS biological opinion, and the flow regimes below these reservoirs have been designed to balance steelhead versus salmon, different salmon runs, cold water pool management, hydropower, agricultural use, and it's a very complex dynamic to set these requirements below these reservoirs, and there's a lot of balancing that goes on. So if you impose a flow requirement in the springtime, it disrupts all of those balances that we've worked really hard to get to. So that's something to consider. You're not just balancing the delta versus upstream, you're changing the balances within those individual streams and how we're managing those streams for cold water and habitat and the trade-offs between different fish species upstream. This next graphic is an example of how reservoirs are managed. And this came up, John Lehigh touched on this a bit yesterday, and it came up a little bit earlier today. To demonstrate how reservoirs are managed upstream, I took a historical period, 2004 to the end of water year 2009. And these are reservoir storages. This is Shasta, historical end-of-month storage, and this is Oroville, end-of-month storage through this period. We start with a below normal year, then we have above normal year in 2005, and in 2006 was very wet. The whole system was pretty wet. And then we go into our drought cycle, dry, critical, and another dry year. I know this is pretty basic, but when the line goes up, we're storing water. And as the line goes down, we're releasing water for beneficial uses. So, we fill in 2005 in Shasta, and then we fill again in 2006, and then we don't fill again until much later after this period. An important thing to note is that the water that's stored in 2005 and then again in 2006 is actually released during the critical period. These are multi-year reservoirs. So water stored in these reservoirs meets multiple beneficial uses, and I know you've heard this over and over again, but the salmon habitat and the stream temperature upstream are really important. The Pacific Flyway, when we're making these releases from the project reservoirs, that's meeting Pacific Flyway needs. It's already being released for the Delta for Spring X2 and for D1641 requirements. Recreation is also a key component here. Urban water supply, and in these dry conditions, public health and safety is very critical. Agriculture, hydropower, and this list goes on and on. There's a lot more than what I'm listing here. Now, I'm imposing on this the periods of the proposed unimpaired flow or potential unimpaired flow requirements from January.
Hold on just a second. You did say proposed.
I changed that. It's potential.
By whom? Where are you getting potential?
I didn't think it was proposed.
But where are you getting potential? I just,
From the 2010 report, it was the unimpaired flow, the 75% was in there.
that's helpful. 2010 report. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should have clarified that. So if you look at the percent unimpaired flow during that January through June period, that's the period that we would be storing water. And if we were to inhibit how much water that we're putting into the reservoirs or storing at that time, we're not going to have that for beneficial use later in the year. Particularly in the drier years, if we're not storing water in these wet years, we're not going to have it to make it through these critical periods. And that's an important component. It's not just 1 year that we're going to have problems in those wet years. It's going to be for many years in a row with a lot of these reservoirs. Another example I wanted to present is the Fall X2. What this example shows, I went back through the same time period and looked at the Fall X2 and the biological opinions as well as the 2010 report because I believe they're the same. And I estimated how much water would need to be released to comply with the X2 requirement in above normal and wet years. And what I estimated that in the above normal year of 2005, it was roughly 150,000 acre feet that would be needed to meet that requirement. In that particular year, if we were to release that water, you'd have lower storage, and I just split it between Shasta and Oroville equally. You go into another wet year, so the reservoirs recover, and it doesn't look like you would have an adverse effect on the system or cold water pool in that particular case. But when you look at 2006, it's a wet year, and the requirement is farther west at kilometer 74, and it's roughly 700,000 acre-feet of increased flow to move X2, average X2 out to that location. Then we go into the drought, and all I did was project that decrease in flow or storage throughout the drought. I'm not saying that it would operate this way, but there would have to be some decrease in beneficial use somewhere at some time to compensate for that. And that's going to come out in terms of temperature and flow requirements for upstream fisheries, for agriculture, hydropower, a lot of things. So it's important to note that even in the fall of a wet year, we rely on that water to make it through droughts. And that's something that is difficult to predict. You know, you're in a wet year, you have a lot of storage, and why can't you release more? It's that drought year protection that's really critical for this state.
I have a question. This is an interesting modeling exercise. When you put up the previous one, pre-model, or could you put that back? I was thinking about the same kind of simulation, but it would be a little more of instantaneous type management action. That is, this idea of a first flush allowance, because there's, and I can't, you know, ascertain all the implications of that, but with a first flush hydrology, you'd have more of that, the components of the water that come with it, as opposed to settled reservoir water. So you could, it'd be interesting to me to see if you took the significant first hydrologic event of each of these years and you let it go through the system to mimic some of those hydrologic effects that are more than just settled reservoir water, and how that would translate through a multi-year drought.
That could be, it depends on the length of time of that pulse. If it's a couple of weeks, that won't have nearly the impact of some of these other flow requirements, and it could be a lot more benefit. So the multiple beneficial uses upstream are really important to consider, particularly when you're looking at habitat. If we're looking at delta flows to protect salmon and we pull the reservoirs down too much upstream, we're not going to have that cold water and habitat for them. So we have to look at the entire life cycle, I believe, and I think other folks have said that as well. The Pacific Flyway is a very important component. There's been a lot of coordination with farmers in the Sac Basin and wildlife habitat. We've expanded the habitat through rice straw decomposition and managing those ponds for waterfowl, and it's become a really big thing for them, and it's helped the Pacific Flyway tremendously. Agriculture, cities, and hydropower. Concluding, tidal flows really dwarf net delta flows and cause a position of the low salinity zone to move considerable distances twice a day. And that's something to consider when setting requirements and using Sacramento River flow to establish the location of the low salinity zone. The actual position of the low salinity zone in X2 is not known, only estimated. And those plots I showed up, there's a lot of uncertainty when we look at the statistical relationships that are based on the flow-based equation for X2. And that drives a lot of the uncertainty here. And there's considerable uncertainty that attempting to control the low salinity zone, or X2, with Sacramento River flows will produce fishery benefits. And that's something I think you heard earlier today. Sacramento Valley consumptive use of water has been essentially stable since the 1970s, while pelagic fisheries have declined. Delta flow requirements based on 50% or 40% of unimpaired flow would have significant adverse effects on Sacramento Valley water resources, including significant reductions in reservoir storage. And the California water systems are managed for multiple beneficial uses, and these would suffer under new flow requirements based on unimpaired flow. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
it is the afternoon of a long 2 days. So perhaps that's framing my question and my sort of frustration right now, but we've heard now from you for almost 40 minutes on what we should not do. What is it that you are proposing we do? Because obviously no action is not a feasible alternative.
I think that's a great question, and
I would hope so.
it's hard to answer, of course, but there's multiple things that are happening in the system right now to manage it for the benefit of fisheries.
We know that.
And so, it's easier to say what not to do than it is what to
We
do.
know
right?
that too.
So, balancing those flows, the increased flows in the delta with the needs for all the fisheries is really important.
I'm still waiting for you to tell me something I don't know.
My middle name's William.
You're right. I did not know that. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but help me out here. I mean, here we are. Well, granted, this is the first in a series of workshops, but here we are towards the end of the second day. And perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I always enter these things with this glimmer of hope, and the glimmer is dying, but I always have the glimmer of hope that these discussions will yield exciting proposals and ideas and solutions. I think we've had little good information, obviously, and good discussion and good debate. I think at one point earlier today, when I accidentally turned on Siri, it did occur to me, maybe I should ask Siri what she recommends for the Delta. And I appreciate that there's been obviously a lot of work. You've all have committed your careers as well as money and resources into this. But I was a member of the State Board's Bay Delta staff who worked on the 1995 Water Quality Control Plan, who worked on Draft Decision 1630. And here we are, years later, the situation is worse. I'm still hearing, you can't do that because of this, you can't do that because of this. Why can't we just talk about what we will do together? And so I'm still waiting for people to come and say, well, here's what we're going to put on the table, here's what we want to do, here's a proposal for moving all of us ahead on addressing these challenges. And while your presentation and the modeling and all that was very interesting, I guess I'm still waiting for some creative approach. If unimpaired flow is not something you embrace, fine, offer me another suggestion. Just don't say the status quo, business as usual, let us do our thing, and we'll let adaptive management take care of it.
You're asking a fair question. I don't have a perfect answer.
Anyone?
I don't think anyone does at this point. Otherwise, we would have something in place, right? There's a lot of things that we are doing in the system, and one of the things that I'm struggling with is that the regulation